Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have already tested at least one of the microphones. It's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. Thank you for joining us at what is the last Bar Council meeting of the year, and very nearly the start of my term as chair next year. And to any of you who end up watching on catch-up, as this is being recorded, thank you also for joining. I'm not going to take an enormous amount of your time this evening. I'm under no illusions about the fact so many of you are here because you want to enjoy the hospitality, the chance to talk to old friends, and possibly get home for a few hours rest before the ashes begin at midnight. I'm hugely grateful to both Grays and the staff for hosting us this evening, and for the work of all of you at the Bar Council involved in the organisation tonight. And of course, because this is a Bar Council meeting, there are a couple of formal things we need to do right at the outset. There are two short papers that Bar Council members who are here tonight will have had already by email. In the stage we're about to get to in the formal meeting, the rest of you will just have to bear with us for a moment, because only Bar Council members have a vote. Those with long memories will recall that last year Derek taught us how to use a doodle poll. He, of course, gave this speech online. It seems a very long time ago that Amanda, 2 years ago, made a speech at Middle Temple when we were all back in person then, but it is a pleasure to be back, isn't it? This year, we've emerged from the online world, at least a little, and can return to a show of hands, something that is possible perhaps online, but better done in person. So the first thing we have to do this evening is vote, members of the Bar Council who are here, for this slate of committee chairs. If anybody's scrambling for a mouse or a little yellow hand, you don't do that, you just raise your hand in just a moment. Can I ask you, please, to approve the list of committee chairs for 2022? Any Bar Council members in the room? I don't think, and if anybody dissents, any dissent? Splendid, thank you very much indeed. Can I immediately thank all of those past retiring chairs who've stepped down? There are some in the room this evening. They've all done spectacular work over the last year during their period of office, and we're very grateful. I'm also extremely grateful to those who are stepping up to the plate in what will be an interesting year ahead. Second piece of formal business is this, the casual vacancies we have. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have said, you've just elected one man whose name didn't make the list. Lest there's any doubt about it, can I add Philip Mead on the European Committee? Philip, I'm sorry about that, your name didn't make it, but any dissent to Philip's name being added as Vice Chair? No, I see none, thank you. Casual vacancies. There were two, and I'd ask you to approve those two names, please, as the vote in the paper you've got. It's Stephen Kenny in the category of self-employed silk, and Kate McDonough in the employed juniors under 7 years. And again, can I ask Bar Council members to vote and approve that? Thank you. It has indeed been a long year, hasn't it? One in which we've begun to live our lives again. It was almost exactly a year ago that news of the first vaccines emerged. In January, we faced the third lockdown. And as the year has gone on, the vaccines worked, we've been able to see more of family and friends, occasionally travel, and to our immense relief, our children have spent more time back at nursery, school, college, and university. Until quite recently, it felt as though things were slowly improving. Of course, in the last 2 weeks, the news has not been as good. None of us know yet what level of threat Omicron may represent, how it may affect our lives in the year ahead. But while we all have a new set of risks to assess, and though we may have a bumpy winter, I'm confident that whatever we face, we will adjust and adapt, just as we have done repeatedly over the last 20 months. Each of you here tonight has played a part, alongside many colleagues, in keeping the wheels of justice turning. Judges, officials, court staff, lawyers, volunteers, everyone's efforts have been remarkable. And barristers have learned new techniques and skills in the way we've conducted cases in courts and tribunals. Organisations like ours are exploring how we best operate in the hybrid world of video and in person. Once was what seemed remarkable is commonplace, isn't it? It's routine for us to hold hybrid events like the hugely successful and recent Bar Conference. And many more like the Pupillage Fair have been online, extending our reach and making the event more accessible to many. Driven in part by Derek's technical expertise, we've experimented with a variety of formats for meetings, and we'll keep exploring what works best for the profession, always looking to encourage the most effective engagement in the work of the Bar Council. And before I say any more, I want to thank two people in particular, our outgoing chair, Derek Sweeting QC, and the chair of the Young Barristers Committee, Joanne Kane. I'm not going to repeat the tributes which were paid to both of them by so many at our last meeting, but all those who are fortunate enough to listen to Derek and Joanne at the bar conference a couple of weeks ago will know how lucky we have been to have them at the helm in such a turbulent time. I'm delighted to welcome Nick Vinal as Vice Chair of the Bar, Michael Polak as Chair of the Young Barristers Committee, and Lorinda Long, who continues as Treasurer. Sadly, Lorinda can't join us tonight, struck down by COVID. I look forward to working with you, as well as all our circuit leaders, committee chairs, and the leaders of the specialist bar associations. There are half a dozen areas I want to cover briefly this evening, and with your indulgence for the next 15 minutes or so. The first of those concerns how we train and support pupils, young tenants, and each other later on in our careers. Matters that I suppose might be loosely described under the banner of the culture of the bar. Like many in this room, my training was distinctly analogue. Some 30 years ago, I was at the Old Inns of Court School of Law, just on the edge of Gray's Inn, without a mobile phone or a computer. For all practical purposes, the internet didn't exist. If I wanted to make a personal phone call in pupillage, I walked up Essex Street to the phone boxes outside the RCJ. Of course, since then, everything has changed. And in the last 2 years, the pandemic has accelerated and consolidated this transition to the digital world. A measure of how far we've come is perhaps something I experienced today at Southwark Crown Court when I called a witness appearing from a magistrate's court in Cumbria through a live link. He was using an iPad on which all the jury materials were loaded and which we'd had delivered to him. Making it all happen was not easy. The resources involved for the police in getting them there were considerable. The efforts of the court staff in both places were enormous. But an elderly man with a heart problem didn't have to travel. And it shows what can be done when the proper resources are applied. But it isn't all good. And I can also say that from my experience today, having tripped over duct tape and have it stick to me every time I try and stand up from my chair in that same courtroom. And so however good parts of the system are, we have a very long, long way to go. Returning to the subject of culture and training. In distance times, our training, of course, began with dinners in rooms like this. At its most basic level, we learned from each other through anecdote and example, from speaking to others. So much of what I still value from my early years emerged from conversations in chambers with people who were not my close friends, nor my immediate peers. But they were people I could trust and were happy to be asked. For a young barrister, access to the silks and more senior barristers with their open doors was a fabulous resource. And the digital era had put stress on this culture long before the pandemic. For a long time now, people have been spending less and less time in chambers, but the last 2 years have made the situation far, far worse. Of course, we've all faced different pressures over the last 2 years, depending on whether we're employed, self-employed, spend most of our lives working on paper, or go to court. Of course, employed barristers working from home largely share much in common with the self-employed on largely advisory work. Some may enjoy the relatively solitary life of working from home in a study, but many more, I suspect, think rather wistfully about the camaraderie of chambers and what they missed from times past. Those who commute from home to a courtroom and back again have for years travelled less into chambers in the evening. Of course, a consequence of digital banking, email, and for criminal practitioners, the digital case system. And as a result, we all have to think about what part the collective plays in our working lives. How do we maintain that culture that was built originally on face-to-face exchange of knowledge and experience? And for so many of us, created the working friendships that have always been such a key component of a barrister's life. Earlier this year, in an online session with the Inns of Court College of Advocacy, I listened to a junior tenant describe what her second six pupillage had been like last year, from April till October. She'd worked in magistrates' courts across the southeast. Of course, all professionals, solicitors, barristers, and court staff face the same daunting conditions in those courts. But pupils finding their feet, anxious about their insecure futures and careers, were perhaps in a particularly exposed situation. To have endured the conditions she and her colleagues across the bar faced, I don't say this lightly, I think was heroic. We owe our pupils and junior tenants a duty to think again about their training and how we support them in their early years. Many of us have done our best to help our recent intakes with WhatsApp groups and the like, but it isn't the same. How can we recreate that sense of chambers when you could walk in with confidence, find people, and knock on any open door? There aren't easy answers. And the challenge only grows because the average age of a pupil is now about 30, just under. And the average age of a barrister, particularly in publicly funded work, is approaching 50. And this has very marked implications for the structure of our profession. What can we do? I suspect a common theme will be the need to recognize that spontaneity doesn't work anymore. I, like others in this room, will have grown up dropping into chambers not so long ago, expecting to bump into any number of friends, to have lunch, a cup of tea, or perhaps even a drink in the evening. That just doesn't happen anymore. We're going to have to be a lot more organized, I suggest, if we want the culture of the bar to survive. And that, in part, to contribute to our training and the quality and the standards which we expect of ourselves and the public deserves. And of course, across the country, chambers will be reflective on their space. Do they have too much? How can they repurpose it? How can they make it more attractive and easier for barristers to maintain the vitality and health of their chambers? If you'll forgive the personal experience, my chambers downsized during the pandemic and has returned from the commercial world to be a tenant of this inn, and we consider it a huge success. We were lucky with our timing. I suspect we're entering an era where the importance of the inns, to many of us, will be greatly strengthened. And it's a good moment for me to say how much I know how much support the inns have offered to the bar in recent years. Their joint contribution to the Bar Benevolence Association last year in April was an example of a huge fillip at an important time for an anxious profession. So lots for us to think about in terms of how we train, how we look after each other, and what we do. The second area I wanted to mention briefly is regulation. The Bar Standards Board has a current consultation out entitled Our Proposed Strategy for the Next 3 Years. Some of you may have participated in roundtable events that I understand they've organised. I would urge you all to read it and respond. But there's a second consultation launched last week that we all need to think about too. And this relates to the substantial budget increases sought by the BSB for the year 2022-2023. Under the overcomplicated system of regulation introduced by the 2007 Act, the General Counsel of the Bar remains the approved regulator. We retain the representative body, but the regulatory function for barristers was performed by the BSB. We have to consult the profession about the budget for the coming year and the implications for the changes to the practicing certificate fee. And then we submit that proposal to the oversight regulator, the Legal Services Board, for approval. Many of you may know this in this room, but not all. Of the annual PCF, 70% goes to the BSB and 30% to the Bar Council. It's one of the reasons that the bar representation fee is so important to the work that we do on your behalf and why we urge you to pay it. Under the LSB's rules, the Bar Council can't accept or reject the BSB's budget. We can ask questions and seek further information. It doesn't take too much imagination to see that a profession burdened by the stresses and strains of the last few years might be less than enthusiastic about increases in regulatory costs, unless there's a proper, reasonable and objective justification. And how perhaps that profession might wish to ask questions about whether or not the regulators are concentrating, as they should be, on their core responsibilities. Many amongst us might reasonably wonder why it is unique that amongst the professions, we, the bar, appear to be paying for the regulation of tens of thousands of unregistered people, growing in numbers at about 2,000 a year, people who've never completed their professional training. The profession might also reasonably want to ensure that the regulator is not exploring ground that should properly remain within the domain of the representative body. There are no clear or easy answers to these tensions, but this debate is going to be important next year, and I'd urge you to reflect upon it. I have no doubt that there'll be more coming down the track from the Legal Services Board too. And so each time you get one of these consultations land through your email or your letterbox, please read it, engage, and respond. We need your views. Thirdly, can I turn to capacity and backlogs and pressures on the justice system? Last year, we rightly celebrated the reopening of the spaces where we could conduct the business of the courts and tribunals. And I am happy to applaud the Ministry of Justice for the work it did in the height of the pandemic in 2020 to reopen the courts. But the debate has now moved on, with a different emphasis in different jurisdictions. None of you need reminding that the backlogs existed long before the pandemic, the result of political decisions to spend less and to limit capacity. Recently, I was sent an image from Twitter where a non-profit organisation had mapped public perception of public spending against the actual numbers. I can't promise you these statistics are wholly reliable, but they are interesting and may tell an important story. In this recent survey, the public thought that in 2019-20, the government spent 12% of its budget on police and crime, when the real figure is about 3.9%. Whatever the truth of those kind of statistics, as we all strive to play our part in helping the justice system recover, we all want the decisions that government makes to be made on the basis of reliable data rather than perceptions and prejudice. In the November 21 spending review, recently announced, a £3.2 billion increase in funding for the MOJ by 2024 to 2025, taking the settlement to £11.5 billion. If delivered, this would reverse a decade of cuts to the justice system. We've acknowledged the increased budget announcement, but it remains to be seen how the final settlement is structured and how the money will be spent. And even if the figures prove to be accurate, I fear it will take more sustained investment over more years to reverse the effects of decline that a decade of cuts have inflicted on the health of the justice system. These have created challenges for us in all jurisdictions. If I may start with civil. You've heard us say before that 5 years now after the court reform programme began, it is frankly astonishing that the county court remains largely paper-based. At the start of that programme in 2016, it took an average of 30 weeks for a small claims case to reach a final hearing. By the beginning of 2020, that figure had increased to just under 40 weeks. By the time we look at the summer of 2021, the impact of COVID perhaps having an effect, the mean time taken for small claims and multi-fast-track trial claims to go to trial was about 12 weeks longer than the same period in 2019. This is the sort of litigation that the vast majority of the public is likely to be involved in, and now takes about 3 months longer than it did 5 years ago. In the family courts, the quarter from April to June this year saw a 14% increase in new cases. The average time for a care or supervision case to reach first disposal was 44 weeks, up 8 weeks from the same quarter in 2020. The number of cases being disposed of within 26 weeks was down compared to the same period in 2020 and the lowest since 2012. The judges and lawyers who work in the family division have done amongst the most remarkable job of all through the pandemic. But these figures show that demand is outstripping capacity in the system. And of course, perhaps the jurisdiction that attracts the most public debate is that of the Crown Court. Many in this room will have read the National Audit Office report, Reducing the Backlog in the Criminal Courts, published in October. It exemplifies what every independent inquiry discovers. The court backlog was the result of a pre-existing problem caused by underfunding and worsened by the pandemic. The NAO warned that the Ministry of Justice needed to provide clearer leadership and improve data and information sharing if it was to keep the backlog manageable in the coming years. Over the weekend, you may have seen the government trail several announcements in the media focusing on law and order as part of what was described by at least one politician as its crime week. Thus, we have learned of new strategies to tackle the business model of drugs gangs, a consultation to enact the Victims' Code into law, and a prisons white paper. We're told that scorecards will be coming soon, which it is hoped will shine a spotlight on where there are delays in the system. There is, we're told, likely to be a continued emphasis on driving up prosecutions and rapes prosecutions and convictions in rape and serious sexual offences. Now, the Bar Council will respond to the detailed proposals when they emerge and will not engage upon speculation based upon press reports. And at all times, what we will do is point out what we think will help achieve timely, accessible justice for all. And we will not be shy of saying when we think that government ideas might be less successful or indeed contrary to the public interest. On television on Sunday, I heard the Lord Chancellor respond to one question about a possible new offence by saying, we should enforce the laws we've got. And I couldn't agree more. The answer to so many of our problems in the criminal justice system is not new laws, nor for that matter, ever higher penalties for the small proportion of cases that are actually investigated and prosecuted. Rather, we should enforce the laws we already have. The government has made strong and clear commitments to restoring public faith in the criminal justice system by increasing the charging and prosecuting of rape and serious sexual offences. And the Bar stands ready to play its part in ensuring that these allegations are tried justly. But we have to ask ourselves if we have the people to meet these public demands. And at the moment in crime, the answer, frankly, is no. There aren't enough judges or barristers. And the backlog which we face is not just much bigger than it was before, but it's actually more complicated, because the proportion of trials, often multi-handed, is more challenging than it was before the pandemic began. And when I'm speaking of people and capacity, I come back to the fact that our profession is aging rapidly, faster, I suspect, than society. You have only to look at the composition of your chambers. Over the last decade, barristers practicing in crime have sought to diversify away from criminal work, and they will not come back lightly. Many who remained last year lost 6 months of income, and the insecurity created by the events of last year, the sheer uncertainty of self-employment, the corrosive effect it has, should not be underestimated. So how do we work to recruit the number of people we need and to keep them practicing in crime? There are 3, perhaps easy starting points, which I suggest. The first 2 require long-term commitment and planning from government. The first is to properly refurbish the court estate. It may take a decade to repair the roofs and broken windows, to replace the failing heating and ventilation system, but the estate has suffered decades of neglect, and we have to acknowledge that it'll take a long time to fix. Secondly, government should, I suggest, invest in a system that would offer all Crown Court cases a trial date within 6 months of first appearance. This should be their ambition. Practitioners, I suspect, would all agree that the number of guilty pleas goes up when defendants think they face a trial, and delay and backlog just makes the situation worse. And from the public's point of view, the attrition of complainants and witnesses who leave disheartened because they've waited for years for their cases to be tried is appalling. Before I leave this second point, I'd like to say something about recent press reports in relation to the proposal we understand that may be coming in about Section 28 pre-recording of evidence. We don't know if the government's true intentions are reflected in those press reports. But I am bound to observe that the experience of most criminal barristers is the courts are not using the powers they already have. Why? First, because the police and the CPS just do not have the time and resources to prepare the prosecution cases and assemble the material that should be disclosed before these hearings can take place. Secondly, the courts are finding that the exercise in scheduling these hearings is causing more delay and trouble elsewhere in the system. Forget any reflection upon what an individual barrister may think about these cases. We fear that the use of this power is counterproductive to the wider desire to get the backlog down. The third suggestion is one that could be addressed in a far shorter time frame. Barristers who work in the criminal courts should be paid a reasonable rate for the work they do. And as importantly, the system should stop requiring them to do huge amounts of work for nothing, preparing all those cases which are never listed at a time when they can do them. This last point brings me to the Criminal Legal Aid Review, CLAR. We understand that Sir Christopher Bellamy's report was sent last week to the Lord Chancellor, and we very much hope it is published before the parliamentary recess next week. I am the first to acknowledge that we cannot expect a full government response by then, but we hope that proposals follow early in the new year. In all these areas, the government must offer proposals that convince criminal practitioners they have a future. If they don't, then I fear that people will continue to vote with their feet and migrate to other better paid areas of legal work or leave the profession. Fourthly, race. I could not make this speech without referencing two reports. The first is the Bar Council's superb report, Race at the Bar, a Snapshot, published a month ago. The co-chairs of our race working group, Barbara Mills QC and Simon Regis, have worked tirelessly with the group, Bar Council staff and many others to produce a report that I think should be required reading for every Chamber's management committee, each in, ideally for all of us. The data shows us that what we feared from anecdote is true. I'd like to quote 4 key findings. The report categorically and definitively evidences in quantitative and qualitative terms that barristers from ethnic minority backgrounds, and especially Black and Asian women, face systemic obstacles to building and progressing a sustainable and rewarding career at the bar. Second, candidates from ethnic minority backgrounds are less likely to obtain pupillage than candidates from white backgrounds, even when controlling for educational attainment, university ranking, grades and degree classes, and so on. Third, even when factoring in practice area, work volume, region, and seniority, women earn less than men. Black men earn less than white men, and Black and Asian women earn less than Black and Asian men, and Black women earn the least. The income differentials vary between practice areas, but are significant. And fourthly, Black and Asian barristers are unrepresented in taking silk. There are just 5 Black or Black British female QCs and 17 male Black British QCs in England and Wales. There are 16 male and 9 female silks of mixed ethnicity. There are 17 Asian British female QCs, 60 male Asian QCs. This compares with 1,303 white males and 286 white females. Now, these numbers may shock some of you, but the data is clear and there is no room for inaction. As Derek said in his foreword to that report, the overall conclusion is clear. There is a moral and practical imperative for the profession to urgently promote diversity and to be more reflective of the society it serves. The second publication is the admirable report of the Northern Circuit, published on the 30th of September. It's an excellent piece of work and one that poses similar important questions. Now, for many years, I thought the right thing to do as a well-meaning, liberal, privileged white male was to be colourblind and to treat everyone equally, to say nothing and almost disregard the question of race. I don't mind saying I now think I was wrong. All of us have a responsibility to ask difficult questions of ourselves. What are we doing to address this unbalance and this unfairness? What is each of us doing in the organisations we participate in to do something about this? In 2022, I will do everything I can to continue to drive the action forward, to pose these questions, and to promote greater diversity at the bar. Of course, part of that process involves the outreach work that so many institutions at the bar are engaged in. And there's much to celebrate that's undertaken by the Inns, the circuits, the SBAs, many chambers, or by a charity close to my heart, the Kalisha Trust. All of us working to try and improve access to the bar from underrepresented communities. And as far as the Bar Council is concerned, much of the vital work we do in this area is funded by the annual contributions made by the Inns. We are ever grateful for their support. Now, our regulators have also carried out and planned work in this area. Of course, that's welcome. But you may think that the task of regulators is to set minimum standards. The role of the professions is to promote and identify excellence and best practice, as the Bar Council and Northern Circuit have sought to do by identifying these matters in their reports. That's the point, after all, of a profession. And there are a couple of reasons why you may think it's important for the profession to take action rather than wait for action by regulators. Firstly, to avoid duplication and unnecessary increased regulatory cost. Secondly, because if the profession takes these steps because they see it as necessary and desirable, as voluntary measures rather than imposed from the outside, they are far, far more likely to succeed. Fifthly, net zero by 2030. Recently, we all watched with interest what happened at COP26 in Glasgow. And you may think it's time for us each to begin a conversation amongst ourselves as to the targets we should be setting. There was a Bar Council paper circulated at the beginning of the year by the Pro Bono and Social Responsibility Committee. The Bar Council already runs the Bar Sustainability Network, which helps in this area. And I hope that next year the Bar Council will encourage all chambers to set ambitious targets and to reach net zero by 2030. And as part of this process, where carbon really cannot be reduced, that we should think about exploring an offsetting fund that will help chambers offset both historical and current emissions. Sixthly, lastly, you'll be pleased to hear, we've left the European Union, of course, now, but we're close to our counterpart associations across Europe and remain close to others around the world. We will continue to cooperate at many levels. Only last Saturday, the Young Barristers Committee held an excellent event in conjunction with the American College of Trial Lawyers and the American Bar Association Litigation Section. We, the Bar of England and Wales, are known and respected for our huge contribution to a multitude of European law projects across competition law, company law, human rights, and many other fields. We will continue making these contributions. In making these contributions, we consolidate our reputation for offering a world-class service, which we must not lose. And of course, we'll keep a watchful eye on the rule of law violations and threats worldwide. As the Bar Council reported in 2020, the pandemic has been used as an excuse for attacks on the rule of law in many places. We shall continue to monitor unjustified threats and attacks on the legal profession, and will work with the Bar Human Rights Committee and foreign bar associations to uphold the rule of law and independence of lawyers. The treatment of lawyers varies enormously, from attacks that involve a politically inspired Twitter pile-on to far worse. But maintaining the freedom of lawyers to practice, to allow their clients to access the courts, to seek redress, to articulate their rights, is essential to the rule of law. Early this year, we faced the unprecedented situation where a nation, China, imposed sanctions against individual lawyers and others in a wholly unjustified way. In August, we were all shaken by the rapidity of the collapse in Afghanistan. The Bar Council has worked behind the scenes to try and help. We've sought to assist judges and lawyers from Afghanistan in their evacuation efforts, while the coalition airlift continued. Many of you will have heard Mrs. Justice Moira McGowan being interviewed by the BBC in October, describing the work she and others had been doing throughout 2021. And we applaud the work of all those who've sought to assist those who've made it to the United Kingdom. And we hope that the government will make every effort to help the many that remain still in Afghanistan who are in desperate need. Finally, this. In the run-up to tonight, I've been asked several times what my priorities are for next year. The truth is that most of all, I think we all need a quiet year, where not much happens, when we can all start to take a little more pleasure in our jobs again, one perhaps where we can see enough of our friends and family. I fear, however, that this ambition is just a little whimsical and the pressures won't ease. So if I may, before we get to the part of the evening which you're almost looking for, can I just conclude by thanking all the barristers who've contributed so much of their time to the Bar Council this year and in the years before. I'd like to thank the Bar Council staff who've worked so hard in 2021, and may I wish you all the best possible break as we reach the end of the year. Thank you.